Hi guys, this is Mr. Pruitt, and I'm talking to you from my dining room tonight. And obviously, I'm not here today, so I'm talking to you about macromolecules and polymers, so that you'll know what's going on. You should know that we are having a test on Friday, and so I'm trying to make sure that we have covered everything that you're going to need to see. So let's review first. The first thing that we need to think about is what we know about biomolecules. And remember that biomolecules are any of the 5 carbon-based molecules that are essential for life. And those are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, which we talked about on Friday. Those are DNA and RNA. And enzymes, remember those are those helper molecules that lower the energy required to make certain proteins. Now, we also have talked a little bit about the function of some of these biomolecules. We said that carbohydrates are here basically for quick energy. Proteins are the raw materials for cell-made proteins, and they also build muscle and tissue, and that they have some limited use as energy for cells in the event of an emergency. We also talked about lipids. That at the cellular level, their biggest function is that they're stored energy, but they also provide some materials that the cell needs, and at the organism level, they provide insulation. On Friday, we talked about nucleic acids a little bit, and remember that DNA and RNA are 2 nucleic acids, and their biggest function is that they contain information or they relay information to different parts of the cell. And then our final one was the enzymes. Remember that enzymes help the cell to make proteins by lowering the necessary amount of energy for protein synthesis and bundling, which basically means that it takes a lot of energy to make proteins. These molecules help us out by lowering that activation energy, lowering the amount of energy that it takes for them to do that. So today we want to talk about, we want to get some vocabulary, and we want to talk about what they call macromolecules and polymers. And really, this isn't anything new that we're talking about, okay? First, you need to remember that all biomolecules, and remember that word literally means life molecules, have the elements carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen in them. Without carbon, the other elements couldn't form these biomolecules. Carbon is probably the most important element in any of these life molecules. Now, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids all contain carbon as the base molecule that these others form, as the base element that these molecules form around. Now, each of these 5 biomolecules are considered to be macromolecules, okay? Macromolecules just mean that they are really, really large. The word macro, the prefix macro, means large. And all 5 of these biomolecules are also called polymers, okay? So we have 3 really big words to describe the same 5 things. We call them biomolecules. They're the molecules that are life. They're large molecules, so we call them macromolecules sometimes. And all of these macromolecules, all of these 5 biomolecules are also considered to be polymers, polymers are really large molecules that are made up of thousands of smaller molecules. Think kind of like paper chains, kind of like this. You have a small piece of paper, and it's linked together to another one, and it's linked together to another one, and eventually you get a fairly large paper chain. But what you need to be thinking about as far as what a polymer is that instead of this being paper, this is a small molecule, and it's attached to another small molecule, and it's attached to another small molecule, over and over and over and over again, until we get to a place where we have one really, really large molecule that we're going to call a polymer. Now, you need to remember that all the polymers are made up of smaller molecules called monomers, okay? All of those small molecules, when we were looking at that paper chain, each one of those little pieces of the paper chain Each little strip of paper that somebody would have taped or stapled together, that would have been its monomer. Okay, the polymer is that whole long chain. The monitor is just those little strips of paper that are used to make the chain. Or if we're talking about actual molecules, what it is the protein or the carbohydrate is a really long chain of really small molecules that are all bonded together. Now, each monomer is its own molecule. It's made up of its own elements. When those monomers are bonded or hook bonded, and that's just kind of a fancy word for saying hooked together, to make a chain of smaller molecules, they form this really large molecule that we call a polymer. Carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, and enzymes are all examples of polymers. So let's talk about these things kind of individually for a minute. Carbohydrates, let's look at carbohydrates first. Carbohydrates are a polymer made up of smaller sugar molecules called monosaccharides. Now, if you notice, there are some things that I have bolded or I have highlighted for you. Those things are super important. First thing you need to know is that monosaccharides are the monomers of carbohydrates. All right, the monosaccharides are the small molecules that we use to make up the big molecule we call a carbohydrate. Now, humans use a monosaccharide called glucose as an energy source for our cellular functions. Okay, and so we can just use just one of these monomer molecules, but they're not. But they're small when they're like this. When we start chaining them up. If we get two of them together, let's say that we have two monosaccharides. One of them is glucose, which is the sugar that we use for our cells for energy, and fructose, which is fruit sugar. When those are bonded together, we get a unit called a disaccharide. Okay, so we put two of them together, we make a chain of just two, and we're going to call that a disaccharide. And then if we start going bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger with it, when we start adding more than two, then we get this polymer, and this one big polymer, we're just going to call it a carbohydrate. Now, the other thing you need to know is that all of these monomers are made up of their own elements, remember? And all of these elements contribute to that polymer. And the elements that make up carbohydrates are real simple. There's only 3 elements in a carbohydrate, but you probably need to know what they are. They're carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So let's talk about proteins and enzymes now. Proteins are also a polymer. They are made up of smaller molecules called amino acids. Amino acids are what we consider to be the monomers or the building block molecules of proteins. Now, remember that although humans can use proteins as an energy source, the primary function of protein is really to make other proteins. Now, the elements that are found in all proteins, and this is a little bit different from carbohydrates, they're a little bit more complex. So the elements found in all the proteins are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just like there are in a carbohydrate. But we also add in the element nitrogen. And the addition of nitrogen is what separates it from being a carbohydrate or a lipid. Now, the other thing you need to know about all of this is that all enzymes are made up of proteins. Okay, an enzyme is a protein with something added onto it. So enzymes are also considered to be a polymer because they're made up of the same things that proteins are made out of. Remember when we talk about nucleic acids that the 2 nucleic acids are DNA and RNA. And we talked about them on Friday a little bit. DNA and RNA are also polymers. They're made up of smaller molecules that are called nucleotides. And this is important for you to know, is that they're made up of these things called nucleotides. Now, nucleotides are made up of a sugar, a phosphate, and a nitrogen base. The 2 sugars that these could be made up of are called deoxyribose and ribose. We find deoxyribose in DNA. In fact, that's where the D in DNA comes from. It identifies the sugar. And ribose is found in RNA. That's where the R comes from. It identifies the sugar that's made up for this nucleic acid. Now, the things that you really need to know right now about nucleic acids is that they are a polymer, that their monomer is called a nucleotide. Nucleotides are made up of sugar and phosphate and nitrogen base, and the elements that make up a nucleotide are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So we've added in a fifth element into this one, and this is actually this is what makes DNA and RNA a little bit more complex because it has another element added into it. All right, now you see this table. This table is going to make your life easy. I really want you to look to copy this over into your notes. Make sure you look over this so that you can connect polymers and monomers and elements to the right things. All right. We'll have a quiz over this on Wednesday, and I'll see you then. I hope that you learned something from it. Have a great night. Bye.